The Friday was a day that we stayed here all day long because we had all day and we did not put time limits, but we will very likely do that today. The chair would ask you to consider being brief if you have signed up. I have members have requested certain folks come forward. If a member of this committee requested that you come forward, the chair will be more lenient with the time. If you are repetitive or have spoke before, the chair will ask you to be brief with your time. So we will certainly try to work in as many people as we have. We have a few on Zoom. The chair will probably go back and forth with some of those folks. What I would like to do before we start today, though, is in Friday's meeting, I mentioned to the committee members that they would receive a copy of a committee substitute that we will be working off of today. You received that on Friday. That is LC 28 2270 LC 28 2207S. I told you on Friday the changes that you would see in there. Today, I want to tell you exactly where those changes are and also to remind you of them because that is the version upon which we will be working. And I certainly will take any questions after I run through these provisions again that I mentioned to you on Friday. In section 2 of the bill, that's on page 3. This is Representative Eddie Lunston's bill that we heard in subcommittee. Representative Lunston had a situation in North Georgia where he represents a county. Their probate judge still runs the elections. He had a situation where his probate judge became sick with the virus. As you know, when a probate judge runs elections, they have to certify the elections. This situation would allow a Superior Court judge to appoint a qualified person to serve in an emergency capacity should the probate judge in this example not be able to serve. I'll go through these and I'll come back to come back for any questions you have on any of them. Section 4 of the bill. Sometimes, as you know, when we make one change, we have to adjust it in more than one section of the bill because it's also touched on in different code sections, and we order our bills by the OCGA code numerical order. These changes affect section 4 and sections 20 and 21. This is Representative Houston Gaines's bill that was also heard in subcommittee that I mentioned on Friday. They had a situation in Athens for the local government there where a individual unfortunately died before the election, but they still were elected. They still received the most votes. Under Georgia law, if a person is deceased, they can obviously not take office and the votes that went to them don't count, and it goes to the person who came in second. In other words, a person who did not win gets to take the office. We're in the minority of states that handle it that way. The majority of states say that you have to have an election to fill that position. We have a situation in nonpartisan races where that is not covered by our law. This changes us to the majority view, whereby if, in this case, a deceased person were actually to win and get the most votes, that would trigger a special election for the people to decide, okay, who do we want to vote for? Who wants to qualify? That is the changes in section 4 and 20 and 21. The next change that I also mentioned on Friday is a bill that Representative Jenny Earhart dropped. She had a situation over in Cobb County where there had been apparently an early voting precinct that had been open for years. So many years that when it was closed shortly before the election, they had to station people there to tell folks, go somewhere else. This place is now closed. You are all aware, I believe, that we have a requirement in Georgia law that if you're going to close a voting precinct outside of an emergency situation, you have to notify within a certain period of time you're going to do that. You can't do it near the election. We have no such provision for early voting locations. What we're doing in this case, based upon the example I just gave you, is making our code consistent, somewhat consistent between how we treat precincts and how we treat early voting precincts. As you all know, early voting has become a bigger part of our turnout. And this says, currently it says, we've been perfecting that language, I'll say that. Currently it says you have to give 60 days notice. After consultation with several of the election directors, Because early voting precincts are set so far away from the election themselves, we thought that 2 weeks notice would be a good notice, because they do indeed have trouble sometimes securing these places, because once again, unlike a precinct, which you're securing for election day, you're securing an early voting precinct for 3 weeks. There's a big difference in the demand that is made upon the location. So they have to work harder, and sometimes it is more of a, I guess you would say, a longer process, and they get approval for places in a later occasion. But we do think some notice should be required if you're going to close an early voting precinct, and the requirement would be 14 days. That is, and I apologize if I didn't say that, Representative, that is section 15 of the bill. Section 15 on page, whoever finds it first can blurt it out, 30, page 30. That's on page 30, and that is in a prior drop bill, as I mentioned also. Making a similarity now with the requirement to notify the voters if you're going to close an early voting location that you've opened before, much like we require notification of precinct changes. Now, in the bill, you will find that it says 60 days. As I mentioned to you, it is the chair's intent to bring a committee substitute that says 14 days. So you will note that one number in the bill that the chair intends to bring a committee substitute to change it to 14 days. The last change is also one that we talked about on Friday, and that is one for the Georgia Municipal Association brought to our attention. It is the last section of the bill, section 29, which is on page 58. The actual operative language is on page 59. We're all aware that because of the virus, the census has been delayed. We will get the census number later than we thought. And as I explained on Friday, the Georgia Municipal Association has realized that they are required, when new census numbers come out, to redraw their districts and have their city councilmen and mayors run from the newly drawn districts. The problem is, by the time the census come out this go around, we could very well run into a situation where they have to qualify in old districts because new ones aren't ready, and then get caught by a law that requires them to run in new districts. So this is a one-time relief period for our local government, our cities rather, that they will be allowed to run in the old districts if the census numbers are not ready in time, which we anticipate. And that is section 29 of the bill. Those are the changes that I mentioned to you that would be coming in the substitute that you got on Friday. Now what I want to do is take any questions about any of those, and then I'll talk to you about some further changes. Chairman Smyer, you have a question? 8? Yes, sir, Chairman.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. On section 29, was that as you enumerated on the others, that they were bills that were introduced?
That one was not. That is
what I'm
one that GMA brought to my attention a little bit later than all those other ideas. And that is their requested language, which we think is good and resolves that one problem. So that you will not find that in another bill.
That's what I'm saying. So that was not a standalone by itself.
Yes, sir. In that way, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Any other questions from any of the committee members about any of those other changes that we had previously talked about that were sent to you on Friday and are now in front of you? Okay. What I would like to do at this time is, as we go through the bill, we are finding more areas where we're tightening up language, and even in some cases adding a couple of things. What I'm going to do now, just like I did on Friday, Legislative Council is preparing a committee substitute for you that you will get. They promised me this evening. You'll have it before tomorrow. Now I'm going to do just like I did on Friday, tell you those changes and answer any questions you have about them. So here we go. One of the changes in the new committee sub that you will receive is a change that requires that all our ballots be printed on something referred to as security paper. I wanted to simply call it a watermark. I am told that I am behind in the times, that you actually can have paper which can be traced as to be an actually approved piece of paper that you would use in our election system, whether it be absentee ballots or in person. And we are preparing language to propose to you that would require that our ballots be on security paper. In other words, if you go to Office Depot, you can't buy this paper. You have to buy this paper from a special production facility, and that is what would be required. If you would make note of these, and I'll come back to you with any questions. I already mentioned to you the 14-day requirement for Representative Earhart's bill on how soon you could change or close an early voting precinct. And the general language is in there, the 60-day requirement in there will simply be changed to a 14-day. The other thing that is already in the bill, we required enhanced notification of the public of the public availability to the parties, to the public, and to the press of testing of our voting machines. One of the further places we are going to require that be advertised is that when the counties get ready to do that, they not only put it in their local website if they have one, little technical difficulties. There we go. Not only do we require that they put it on publish it in their legal organ, but also on their website. We're also going to require one more thing, is that they put it on the Secretary of State's website. They send it to the Secretary of State, so it's even more widespread information about the public's ability to come and observe the testing that is required under our law of our voting machines. You also know in the bill that you had before you, as was introduced and is currently before you, there is a requirement for the first time in Georgia law that our poll watchers have some sort of certified training. So the first time they walk in to view an election process is not the first time that someone has spoke with them about it and been trained about that. Nothing changes that requirement that's been in the bill since the start. We're simply going to have the parties tell us through a basic certification that they have indeed carried out that training for their designated poll watchers. And lastly, as you know that we have discussed before, one of the things in the bill is a requirement that if a third-party group sends out an absentee ballot an absentee ballot application to an individual, that is a First Amendment right. We believe they have the right to do that, but we're requiring them to clearly notify the individual that you are receiving an absentee ballot application. Who are you receiving it from? That it is not a government sending it to you. We simply are putting language similar to things already allowed in the federal elections code that require that it be large and obvious language. We had some thought about requiring the actual font size, but because sometimes of different languages these items go out in, because sometimes a mail out may be an 8.5 by 11, sometimes it may be a 17 by 11. We simply mirrored federal language, which will require large and obvious language on that print that is already required in the bill. Those, ladies and gentlemen, are the changes that I would bring to your attention that will be in a committee substitute that you will receive this evening. Is there any questions that anybody on the committee has about those items that I just mentioned to you? I'd be happy to answer them. Representative Burnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there going to be I remember that Representative Alexander asked you on Friday, I think it was, about a fiscal note. So who will pay for the security paper, the training? Who will pay for those items?
The paper will be paid for by the same individuals that pay for it now, and that's the local governments. The training will be paid for by the same people that are proposing the poll watchers. That is the parties.
That is who?
The parties.
The parties. Okay. And then one other question, just for clarification. You said when the third party sends out an absentee ballot, so you want them to put that
Absentee
notice?
ballot application.
Absentee
Yes,
ballot
I do the same
application.
thing all the time. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want them to put that information on that application, on that form? Is that what you're asking?
They're required to in the bill and have since it was introduced. This is just saying it has to be basically large and obvious.
Okay.
In other words, you can't hide it in the corner who it's from.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from representatives about those issues that I brought up? Representative Spire, did you have a question, sir?
I want to follow up the Representative Burnow's
Yes, sir.
question on the absentee ballot, that application, that making sure that they're clearly certified. Is that in here, or this is just something new that's going to be brought to the bill? In other words,
It's been in there since the
that's
start.
what I
Yes, sir.
thought. So
Yeah,
so-
it's nothing new. Only new part is, once again, the language has to be open, obvious, and large, where you can tell where it came from, and that the fact that it's not sent to you by a local government.
And this will be applicable to all those
Anybody.
nonprofits or anybody else that send out absentee
Yeah,
ballot applications.
they're one of the biggest contentions, I guess you would say, that I heard, several members have heard, is that many members of the public thought that they received 7, 8, 9 absentee ballots. What we find out in most instances, overwhelmingly most instances, what they received is 5, 6, or 7 absentee ballot applications. There are several things that we're trying to do around that area to resolve the confusion that took place this past election. One is, in the bill, that local governments and state government will no longer send out unsolicited absentee ballot applications. Now, there are some people who would like to say nobody should do that, but we get into a freedom of speech issue. I cannot tell you, within some reasons, you cannot send out something as far as campaigning. And the idea would be that that would be interpreted as campaigning. Therefore, we will simply say that if you send it out, there will be one standardized form. That form will not be pre-filled out, because another problem that we found is a lot of those forms were pre-filled out incorrectly. And it caused a lot of problems when it came into the boards of elections. And if you do send it out, you have to say who you are, let the people know this is not sent by a government, and that language has to be what I call open and obvious. That's a summary of our prior discussions on those issues.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Any other questions from any committee members about the committee substitute draft that you will receive this evening that we will work off of? Okay. The chair sees no other. If you think of a question, you can certainly pop back up later, and I'll be happy to discuss that with you. I will make one other note. There are other areas that I think are worth attention. One of those areas that I suspect you will see more discussion about is the idea of what I will refer to as underperforming boards of elections. It seems that in Georgia, we have, unfortunately, the same counties tend to have problems year in and year out. All counties have some problems. No day goes perfect, but there are certain counties that seem to be before the State Board of Elections over and over again with consistent problems. Chairman Shaw has a subcommittee meeting that a notice has already gone out on that will meet tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock in 132 Capitol. That's the House Judiciary Committee room. There's a subcommittee tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in 132, chaired by Chairman Blackman, a member of this committee. Basically, if you are not on Chairwoman Rich's subcommittee, you are on this subcommittee. Like I said, you should have already gotten notice of it. One of the bills that he will be discussing is a bill that begins to attempt to think of a way to address this problem of reoccurring difficulties by some of our boards of elections, and what, if anything, could or should be done about that. And so I would ask you to pay particular attention to that subcommittee discussion, because I myself am talking to folks about ideas of how we could address these reoccurring problems. And something that I want this committee to focus on as we work through this process. There are other processes in state government whereby we deal with problematic local entities. Many of you are aware of the fact that there are some counties, school boards, that have gotten in so many problems they almost lost their accreditation, and their kids graduating from those high schools could not have used their diplomas to get into colleges We have a procedure in state law whereby if that situation gets that bad, the governor, through a process of hearings and other due process proceedings, can step in temporarily and take action to get that school board back on the right tracks. That has happened successfully on several occasions I'm aware of, not only in the metro area, but over in my area toward Augusta, where school systems have gotten off track and the governor has stepped in under the law and helped them get back on track. That is the concept that I bring to mind when I think of how we may step in and try to help local governments that are repeat offenders and a lot of problems. Once again, the idea being we are a dual system, mostly a county by county election system in the state. Secretary of State has some oversight ability, but when a county continuously puts in jeopardy people's ability to vote and the ability for the public to have confidence in their voting system, it is probably then the responsibility of the state to have more oversight over that situation. So pay close attention to Chairman Shaw's subcommittee hearing in the morning. All right. We have several people that have signed up that want to give testimony about House Bill 531. It is the chair's intention to mostly work with the in-person list. I do have some of you that have requested people by Zoom, and there are time constraints. I will try to honor those. So if you see us going back and forth a little bit, that is one reason why. But what I would like to do is begin with our in-person list, and I would ask you to be brief in your comments. The chair's definition of brief is in the 3 to 5 minute range. If you have been requested to be here by a certain member, the chair will be more lenient with the time. If you are repetitive or have already spoke, the chair will be less lenient with that time frame. So I'm going to start through our list. And first I would ask Liz Thrope to come forward. Did I pronounce that right?
It's Liz Troop.
Troop. Okay.
Troop.
Actually, you
Yeah.
know, I'm going to ask for grace. It was spelled differently than that.
It's THROOP Troop.
Okay. It is spelled that way. It
Yeah,
it doesn't sound like Troop.
It
All
is.
right.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, good to have you, Miss Troop. Please tell us who you're with, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm a DeKalb County voter, and I appreciate your letting me come speak today. This committee on election integrity is considering HB 531, and it's an everything but the kitchen sink bill that doesn't do a lot to further election integrity. Of all the troubling things in this bill, the provision to make observing someone else's vote a felony is to me the most unnerving, especially given the enormous touch screens that in-person voters are required to use. Line 1483 says, any person who knowingly observes or attempts to observe any elector to see how such elector marks or has marked his or her ballot, except in strict accordance with this chapter regarding assistance in voting, shall be guilty of a felony. Consider how many poll watchers and even regular voters just would not want to take the risk of facing a felony for something that anybody could accuse them of at any time. I have observed and poll watched at dozens of polling places across more than a dozen counties since the pilots for the new voting system in 2019. Yet each time I enter a polling place and see those glowing jumbotrons, usually facing toward me, I'm shocked. It's hard not to see someone else voting under those circumstances. Last year, the Secretary of State told counties to turn the screens to face toward outside walls, but polling place managers have to deal with a lot of different room configurations, limited electrical supply, concerns about voters tripping over electrical cords, and whether anybody is tampering with the voting machines. So they often face the machines toward the center of the room for lack of better options. And even the suggested room arrangements can seem private until a line of voters starts snaking around the room, or until voters start walking behind other voters on the way to and from their voting machines. Georgia has largely been spared big crowds this year because of COVID, but already widespread concerns and complaints about privacy will escalate when the crowds return. I saw a video of a big December rally in Alpharetta in which a rather hysterical voter accused a poll worker at Dunwoody Library of demanding to see the voter's printed ballot. The voter thought the poll worker wanted to see who she had chosen for president, when in fact the poll worker just needed to know the precinct so she could direct the ballot to the correct scanner. Ballot secrecy can be an emotional topic. This body has the power to make our voting system private, but this is not the way. I really want to think that you did not write this provision to intimidate people who are providing voting assistance, intimidate poll workers, intimidate poll watchers, or intimidate regular voters. But this provision shows how poorly 531 has been thought through. Please do not pass this bill out of committee. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate you being here today. Okay. Gayla Tillman. Ms. Tillman, welcome. Good to see you. Please go ahead and restate your name and tell us who you're with, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
Cool. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gayla Tillman. I'm here as a concerned native Georgian, but also as an organizer for Georgia Conservation Voters. I speak before you today in opposition of 531 because of the restrictions that this bill would pose on early voting and advance voting. This in 2020, Hurricane Zeta, I'm sorry, hold on. I'm sorry.
You're doing fine. Go ahead.
But in 2018, there was a hurricane you guys are likely familiar with, Hurricane Michael, that absolutely devastated parts of Southwest Georgia. So much so that Governor Deal had to push back the registration deadline for voter registration. And so I bring this up because in 2020, there was another hurricane, Hurricane Zeta, that left thousands of Georgians without power. And the reason why Brad Raffensperger thought it not urgent to make sure that cities had more days for early voting is because there was already another day for early voting. And so for me, I think there should be less restrictions on early voting, specifically to make sure that there are a multitude of options to make sure that Georgians who may have missed it due to natural disaster, due to damage to their property rights, make sure that they have the time to cast their ballot. And then lastly, I wanted to mention internet access. Internet access is still a digital divide in the state of Georgia that has not been fully reconciled. Thankfully, we are progressing. However, all Georgians do not have access to broadband internet, which will severely impact their ability to get to an absentee ballot. For example, if you need to get your ballot fixed or to get it reconciled, you need to be able to check what's the status of your absentee ballot. We are at the benefit that you can check early voting wait times and where your ballot is and things like that. That is if you have access to broadband internet. And that is really significant when you think of, yes, the metro, like a larger county, but also rural counties like in South Georgia, in Middle Georgia, in East Georgia. So I say all of this to really oppose this legislation on the grounds that we should be working to expand the infrastructure of our elections in the same ways that we should be expanding efficiency in the state of Georgia. One of the first hearings for this bill was the word efficiency. And as someone that cares about the energy sector in Georgia, I love the word efficiency. So in order for all of this to work, we have to make sure that we are assessing on the basis of the climate and the fact that the climate is unpredictable. People of Texas probably did not see an ice storm wiping out all that power. So that's how we should operate when it comes to our elections, because it can be a life or death situation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here today. Okay, thank you, Representative. Okay, I mentioned to you that we would go back and forth between Zoom and in person some. This is one that this is a witness that a member requested, and I want to go to Miss Sylvia Lewis on Zoom. Miss Sylvia Lewis, if you can hear me, we will.
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Do we have a picture of Mrs. Lewis, or we will? Yeah. House audio. We'll have you switched on here in just a second to get your picture. Ms. Lewis, we appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you
Okay,
for
we
having
appreciate you
me.
being here with us today. Please introduce yourself and tell us who you're with and where you're from, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
So my name is Sylvia Lewis. I'm a resident of Houston County, and I'm the wife of an active duty military officer. Our family was restationed to Georgia last summer. So my question to you is, did you know that you do not have to prove you're a Georgia resident to register to vote or to actually vote in Georgia? It's the question I've been asking many people over the last several months, and the answer I usually get is a resounding, of course you do. It's the law. I've heard this from many friends, even poll workers themselves, but no, it's not. You do not have to prove you are a resident. Shortly after moving to Georgia, we purchased a home, as did my mother. Now, since this is our second time around in Georgia, I remembered that to get a driver's license in the state, you needed to provide things like passport, social security card, birth certificate, and 2 forms of proof that you're a resident, like utility bills or bank bills, pretty much everything except for your blood. So when my mother, myself, and 2 of my adult children went to register to vote in Georgia, not all at the same time, we brought all of the paperwork we thought we needed, included proof of residency. On 3 separate occasions, my family members and I were never asked for proof of residency. And even though we offered to show them, they did not even want to see it. All we had to do was fill out a piece of paper, sign, and provided our out-of-state driver's license. Afterwards, I thought, how could this be? I was shocked. They had no way of knowing whether I actually lived at the address that I just put down, that I was a resident in that county, much less the state. So I did contact the Secretary of State's office, and I spoke to an election official, and he confirmed that proof of residency was not required. And it shocked me. I questioned that this kind of made the system open to fraud. So my family members and I voted in the general election and the special election legally with just an address and an out-of-state license, never having to show proof. So a month ago, I read an article that the Georgia legislature was considering correcting and strengthening our election laws. However, I did not read that proof was going to be required to ensure that only Georgia voters voted in Georgia elections. That is when I contacted my representative, and that is why I'm here today. So while Georgia has a residency requirement, proof does not have to be shown, kind of making it words with no meaning. I think it's a dangerous loophole that takes power away from the people who actually live in Georgia and potentially puts that power into the hands of non-residents. The statute only says the Board of Registrars may consider evidence, but not must. So this is the most basic requirement that almost everyone assumes already exists, but does not. And I just feel like it needs to be corrected. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate you being here today. Okay, we'll go back to in person. Mr. James Woodall. Mr. Woodall, good to have you. Representative Calvin Smyrie has requested that you speak to us today. Welcome, good to see you. And please introduce yourself, tell us who you're with, and we'd be happy to hear from you. I'll try to watch the mic when you clean it next time if someone does.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So good afternoon. My name is Reverend James Woodall, and I'm the state president for
I
the Georgia.
apologize, I didn't know you were Reverend. I'd have called you that.
It's
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah,
We'll still be praying for you.
I need it.
So I'm the state
But then
president
again, I think we're all standing in the need of prayer, aren't we?
at all times,
At all times.
without
Amen.
ceasing. So I'm the state president for the Georgia NAACP, and I do have the distinct honor of being able to preside over 180 units throughout the state of Georgia and over nearly 10,000 NAACP members as well. And the mission of our organization is to secure the political, the educational, the social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and ensure the health and well-being of all persons in this state and throughout this nation. I do also want to take a moment of personal privilege to give thanks to the National Office of General Counsel, as well as the Lawyers Committee, for doing a very extensive review of not only the original bill, but also the substitute that was submitted on Friday as well in preparation for this testimony. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I would like to really just go through 5 specific sections of the bill that really cause concern for our organization. One, when we look at studies as it relates to voting rights, we understand that every time that there is a barrier that Black voters have to jump through, the likelihood of them participating in the voting process decreases dramatically. Chairman Fleming, you were quoted saying in the media that 97% of registered voters in Georgia have a driver's license or some other state issued ID. And though I would question specifically where that comes from, even if we were to assume that those figures were correct, that would leave about 210,000 Georgians, eligible Georgia voters, without access due to these ID requirements that are here on lines 846 through 848.
Reverend, explain to me why they wouldn't have access.
They would not have access. I'm gonna go through the reasons why.
Go ahead and explain that point to me. You made a good one. I want to clarify it.
Okay, so one, when we look at the issue of ID requirements, it does not talk about the access to alternate forms of ID. So whenever there's an individual that does not have a social security number or a driver's license, what the registrar would do is create a unique identification number. And what we saw in litigation was that even if this person gets a unique form of identification, which is an ID number, there is still issues as it relates to inputting that information to the DDS system or into ENET. And so what we found in our litigation was that even if this person has a unique identification number, the information that is placed on the absentee ballot in this legislation could very well be different than what is actually in the ENET system. And so that would create another barrier for an individual voter who, by no fault of their own, would be disenfranchised and would have to go through extra hoops to be able to participate in the electoral process. Is that, I just want to make sure. Okay.
You explained.
Okay.
I disagree, but you explained.
Okay.
Yeah.
So next, this section does also not aid in ensuring that pretrial detainees who do not have access to their IDs while in custody would be able to apply for and send back their applications and ballots with the ID information or copies of other forms of identification. While we do know, and we've worked with them, some sheriffs may be open to helping these detainees with this process. But we anticipate that this would oftentimes, as it does currently, result in an extra charge for this service, which would institute a poll tax and would again disproportionately impact Black voters who, may I remind this committee, that are innocent until proven guilty under the rule of law in this country. And so if they are pretrial detainees, they are oftentimes disparately poor and African-American. If we have this bill into law, this again would disenfranchise those individuals. Thirdly, the Georgia General Assembly is currently considering a bill, House Bill 246, that increases the amount that it would cost to obtain a driver's license, which again in a state where the minimum wage is $5.25, would discriminately impact Black and poor Georgians throughout this process. Higher percentages of Black and brown Georgians live in poverty. Now, this could be considered another form of a poll tax. And so, not to mention the security risks, especially for the blind and the disabled voters who could be taken advantage of if they provide their ID to people or a copy place like a Staples or Office Depot, or even to a third party to copy for this purpose. The next section that I want to address is line 791. According to the Center for New Data, approximately 10% of all Georgians, including myself, voted during this last election cycle on the weekend. Weekend voting helped decrease wait times throughout this entire state. And to eliminate that would be and create additional wait times statewide for all Georgians, not just Black voters. But to speak specifically about African Americans, 107 counties out of 159 saw African American voting at higher rates than voters self-identifying as white in the same county. Voters in predominantly Black neighborhoods wait on average 29% longer than those in non-Black neighborhoods. They're also 74% more likely to wait for more than half an hour to vote. And then to make matters worse, we saw during this last election cycle, organizations and businesses and corporate partners like the Mercedes-Benz Stadium and the State Farm Arena trying to do their part to help Georgians show up and show out on election day. And this bill will prohibit them from being able to do exactly what they did this last election cycle. And I don't think that that is democracy. So we know that more options lead to less wait times and more voters would participate, but this bill would really take that ability away. The next section I want to bring up is lines 148 through 161, and then lines 800 through 809, which describes the massive poll closures and precinct consolidation. You see, these precinct changes as they occur, whether it's in Athens, Clark County, or in Statesboro, Bullitt County, or in Savannah, Chatham County, or in Jeff Davis County, or in Fulton County, whether they are within that time period allowed by law, or even within those 60 days prescribed by this piece of legislation, they always disproportionately come and show up in African-American communities. And we saw that again during this last election cycle. The precincts that were most at risk of closure before Election Day would have affected nearly 50,000 Georgian voters, which constituted about 6% of all voters that showed up in the last election. And then to make matters worse, lines 1100 or 1104 through 1106, that would be, really constitute a direct assault on the NAACP alone. Because like many organizations, we don't get paid for this work. Many people think the NAACP has a lot of money. Most of our, really all of our people are volunteers. And this bill would criminalize that volunteer activity. Let me repeat, would criminalize volunteer activity. And instead of promoting the positive that is civic engagement, this General Assembly is considering throwing NAACP members in jail for simply trying to make sure that voters have water during the heat of the summer, if we have an election at that time, or if it's cold, we would have, the things, or if it's raining, ponchos, those kind of things. And we've had conversations with the Secretary of State office about this. And again, I would tell you, there's a scripture actually in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1, it says, woe unto those who legislate evil. And I'm afraid that this particular provision is the most evil of it all. To convince volunteers that are committed to the democratic process, that are not partisan in nature, that what they're doing is illegal. And so I would challenge that provision. And lastly, as I close, it saddens me that we have not heard directly from the Secretary of State himself. Now, we've heard from Ryan Germany and we've heard from his office, but the duly elected Secretary of State has not made public comment about this piece of legislation. I think that that's important for this committee to consider. Voter confidence is improved through community engagement and education, not through barriers and decreased access to the voting booth. Eliminating Sunday voting and one day on Saturday is a direct message to Black voters here in the state of Georgia, as well as the Black church in our historic Souls to the Polls campaign that we've seen numbers of communities, organized and mobilized to show up and show out to vote. That lets us know that our faith in this democratic process is not considered during this hearing, nor this committee's deliberations. We recognize that this body desires uniformity, but this bill still would allow counties to voluntarily extend polling hours from 7 to 7, from 9 to 5. This General Assembly's attack on the Black vote has been going on for years. For example, back in 2014, former state Senator Fran Miller said that he'd prefer more educated voters rather than a greater increase in the number of voters, in frustrated reference to Sunday voting hours in DeKalb County at the mall there that was predominantly frequented by Black Georgians. And so, Mr. Chairman, we stand in direct opposition to this legislation because we believe that the right to vote is the most sacred right of it all. And this piece of legislation, though very, very detailed, we don't believe that this is in the best interest of our state. And with that, I'll yield for questions, or if not, I'll stop.
Appreciate you being here, Reverend. Thank you. Next on the list, we have another guest of Representative Smyre, Chris Bruce. Mr. Bruce, this is your second time addressing us, correct?
Not for this bill, Chairman Fleming. I've been in front of you for several years now. So I always been, but this is the first time the ACLU has commented on 531.
Good, but you haven't been before us on this bill previously?
Correct.
Okay, good to see you today.
Good to see you too, Mr. Chairman.
And welcome to hear from you.
Excited for the conversation, Mr. Chairman, and members of the special committee. As stated before, my name is Christopher Bruce. I'm the political director for the ACLU of Georgia, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to promoting civil liberties for all Georgians. And as we all know, the right to vote is one of the most sacred civil liberties we have as Americans. Georgians cast their ballots securely and legally in 3 ways: absentee by mail, early in person, and on election day. House Bill 531 adds significant barriers to each one of these forms of voting without justification. And we urge the committee not to pass this bill as written. I would like to offer a framework for considering the changes to Georgia election law, something that we all can agree on. For any method of voting that Georgia voters actually use to exercise their right to vote, a strong presumption should exist for the exact method of voting to be maintained. So any proposal that would cut one of these methods of voting should require the highest standards for Georgians. That includes deliberation, transparency, evidence beyond a reasonable doubt for such a change to be justified. So our sacred constitutional right to vote demands such a standard, and the proposed cuts to voter access in HB 531 do not meet these standards. First, HB 531's restrictions on early voter access are deeply harmful and unjustified. More than half of the 5 million votes in the general election were cast early. That's over 2 million voters. We should recognize the fact that early voting is the preferred method for Georgia voters and expand early voting access by establishing minimum standards for the number of early vote locations in a given jurisdiction in accordance with best practices. But instead, this bill bans all counties from offering voting on any Sunday and one of the 2 Saturdays during the early vote period. Hundreds of thousands of working Georgians across this state cast ballots during this past cycle on early voting days that this bill would eliminate. And that's 137,969 people for the general election. And that was also 105,516 for the runoff. Second, the bill unjustifiably restricts election day voting by invalidating out-of-precinct provisional ballots. Georgia voters legally cast tens of thousands of these ballots during the general election. That's 11,120 for presidential. And during the runoff, we had 10,034 for the Senate. Voters may show up to out-of-precinct polling locations for any number of reasons. They may have had polling locations just been reassigned to a different polling location mid-cycle, or they may assume that they can vote at any location in the county, just as they can during the early voting period. On January 5th, for example, the North Annex and C.T. Martin Recreational Center, polling locations that were in Fulton County, which had served as both consolidated polling locations and early voting locations earlier in the cycle, together served more provisional voters than regular voters on January 5th. Georgia voters who have taken the time to show up in person to vote on Election Day should not be penalized for showing up at a polling location outside of their precinct, particularly when the law provides election officials with all the tools they need to verify their votes after the polls close. Invalidating out of precinct provisional ballots takes away a critical backstop for Georgia voters without making Georgia elections any more secure. And third, the bill significantly curtails the right to vote absentee by mail. Whereas election officials can begin mailing ballots to voters 49 days out of the election, this bill would force election officials to wait until just 29 days before the election when processing the last-minute voter registrations and preparations for early voting, which would be in full swing at the time. The bill would make absentee ballot drop boxes functionally useless by allowing them to be placed only inside early voting locations. So again, let's take Fulton County, for example. 142,356 Fulton voters deposited their absentee ballots in drop boxes for the general and runoff elections. That was 79,460 voters in the general, 62,896 for the runoff. Out of that group, 25,653 turned in their absentee ballots earlier than the 25th day before the respective elections. So that's October 9th and December 11th. Thus, a large group of absentee by mail voters in Fulton County turned in their absentee ballots by drop box before this bill would have even allowed them to receive their absentee ballot in the first place. And well before it would have been allowed these voters to access these drop boxes. That's the issue. So Georgians who vote absentee are disproportionately older. 42% of absentee voters in the general and 47% of absentee voters in the runoff were ages 66 or older. By definition, the nearly 600,000 voters who were on the rollover absentee ballot list this past election cycle were either Georgians with disabilities or those aged 65 and older. To delay a vulnerable group of voters from receiving their ballots by 20 full days when the data clearly shows that many of these voters choose to start filling their absentee ballots out and turn them in and much earlier than that is definitely unwarranted. The issues with HB 531 that I've identified today are just the tip of the iceberg. There are substantial changes to Georgia's election code should only come about after a careful, considered, evidence-based process with important stakeholders at the table, the most important of whom are 7.5 million registered voters in Georgia. HB 531, which makes large cuts to voter access without justification, falls short of this goal and does not reflect what Georgians will be voting for. We urge this committee to consider these concerns and not pass the bill as written, and I yield for any questions.
Mr. Bruce, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee.
Brad Carver. Mr. Carver, good to see you today.
Thank you, Mr.
Welcome. Please introduce yourself and we'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Brad Carver. I'm a resident of the city of Atlanta and Fulton County. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Hall Booth Smith and have spent quite a significant amount of time doing election law work. And I chaired the Election Confidence Task Force. I will note that Joel Natt, who is a Forsyth County Election Board member, will be following me in this presentation. But we had 7 subcommittees as part of our group. And those consisted of the Voter Registration Committee, which Joel Knapp chaired. We had the Absentee Ballots Subcommittee and in-person voting, which Kathy Latham chaired. I do know that the Coffee County Election Superintendent Misty Martin is going to testify or schedule to testify by Zoom from Coffee County. The Transparency Subcommittee was Joe Proenza. The non-governmental entities was Betsy Kramer. The Election Process Subcommittee was David Bell Isle, and the Legal Subcommittee was Alex Kaufman. For everybody here, I have spent my career doing local government work and election law work, going back to when I was at the University of Georgia School of Law, and Perry Sintel was my local government and legislative professor over there. He recently passed away, but certainly has been an acknowledged expert in the areas of election law, local government, and frankly, political history in the state of Georgia. I will
And
say
he was also my law school professor at the University of Georgia, and one of the best law school professors I ever had, and he recently passed away. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I think the speaker did a special resolution for Professor Sintel because he had been taught by Professor Sintel as well. So
he truly was an amazing
appreciate you
man.
mentioning that.
And Mr. Chairman, on behalf of you and Representative Douglas and many other members of your committee here that are Georgia Bulldogs, I do want to note for the record, I do have my Bulldog pin, which I think matches Representative Douglas's.
He and I both think you get brownie points now.
Thank you very much. I will say that our committee has spent several months on this, looking at these various issues. We had election board members like Joel Natt. We had election lawyers, precinct managers, statewide poll watchers, ballot adjudication panel members, and a depth of resources from all across the state of Georgia. One thing that I will tell you is I have received thousands of emails, not nearly what the members of this committee have received. I'm sure y'all are getting that and getting tagged every day. I want to thank you for your hard work on this issue. Y'all are a part-time legislature. I know how much time this is spent and how much time it is to hear from people, especially of an issue of this magnitude. What I did hear over and over again is that we need to restore faith and confidence in our election system, and that election integrity is extremely important. We did look at both of those, election integrity and restoring confidence in our system as our dual purposes on this study committee. I'll say after the 2018 election, there was a lot of frustration, and there was a lot of lack of confidence among folks in Georgia from the left side of the aisle, or from the Democratic side. Well, you certainly saw that from the Republican side. So one of the things that I told our task force is we need to look at this as bipartisan, and at the end of the day, that frankly, all voters need to have that kind of confidence. Now, one thing that is heartening from the 2020 election is we had the biggest voter turnout we've had in 120 years in Georgia. It was ahead of the national average, and it was the biggest election since 1900 in terms of voter turnout. So the passion was there. It was passion from the left, right, center. That's certainly going to be the case. We think that we need to have a system where every legal vote counts in this state. I will tell you that at the end of the day, we are hearing from our voters that have lost confidence. And so one of the things that we say over and over again is, at the end of the day, people need to feel like we have a fair, a transparent system where every legal vote counts, and that folks feel safe and that everyone is able to participate. So at the end of the day, we had certain recommendations that stood out above the rest. One of those is that we advocate for following what the state of New York has as far as absentee ballots. The state of New York has 8 excuses that can be used to request an absentee ballot. So we do encourage this committee to look at that. We feel strongly that at the end of the day, you have 3 weeks of early voting, including weekend voting. and that is the most secure means of voting. Y'all are familiar with the President Jimmy Carter, James Baker Commission from 2005. That committee found that absentee ballots were the largest source of potential voter fraud. And there's a simple reason for that, because when you come in person, it is a secure method of voting. When votes are cast by mail, that is where the potential for voter intimidation can happen the most. And that's exactly why President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker found that absentee ballots ought to be used as, frankly, a last case scenario when early voting is not allowed. Now, you heard from an election law expert in your testimony on Friday, nonpartisan, and what she commended the state of Georgia is on our options, because we have such extensive early voting, and we've had a number of people, you've heard this testimony, are taking advantage of those early voting periods of time. We do think that that's extremely important. Our next recommendation was on photo ID. We do think that photo ID for absentee ballots it makes sense. I will cite to you the AJC poll that recently came out. In that poll, the question was, do you support or oppose requiring voters to include a copy of their photo ID or other documentation in order to cast an absentee ballot by mail? The answer was 74% of Georgians support having such a requirement. Now, we'll note that was actually to have a photo ID. What the bill that's before you, House Bill 531, requires just a driver's license number or a state-issued ID number. And if you think about it that way, that may be even less of a burden. And I think if the poll was asked about that particular thing, I think it would be even stronger support than 74% across the state. So I do commend this piece of legislation with that particular item. And I will also note that in the committee hearing on Friday, we heard about concerns of PII. And certainly PII disclosure is something we all need to be concerned about. But I will note that in this piece of legislation, where the PII would be is under the fold. So once the outer envelope is sealed, you can't see that personal identifiable information on the envelope. So it is secure. It would only be seen by somebody that is working the election after they've opened the envelope. And so I do think that is answers the criticism for the PII. I will also note the second question from the poll was this: do you think it is more important to make voting easy for eligible voters or to have additional safeguards against potential voter fraud? That question was making it easier, 41% of Georgians. Additional safeguards was 55%. Again, this was a poll of voters statewide in the state of Georgia. I just wanted to point you to that. The next thing that we advocate for is opt-in for motor voter. We do encourage you to look at the Maryland state law, which is what our task force recommends that the state of Georgia follow. Next to absentee ballots, the registering of voters through the voter ID problem is one of the other areas of concern in terms of securing our voter roll. The next thing that we would advocate for is updating our voter rolls and updating the voter challenge statutes. One thing we have found over the last few months is that we have a serious voter registration problem in the state of Georgia. There are about 1,061,000 voters in Fulton County, and right now 78% of Fulton County are registered voters. That number is exceptionally high. In fact, it's impossibly high, because there can't be that many people registered in Fulton County based on the electorate. The reason that's the case is there is a significant number of folks that have passed away that are on the voter rolls. There's also a very large number of people who have moved out of the state of Georgia that are registered to vote in Fulton County. I'm just using Fulton County as an example. It is where I live. But that creates a problem. That is an insecure voter roll. And that is what can lead to lack of confidence in our system when you have people like your former colleague, who I was a very close friend with, Representative Harry Geisinger. He is still on the voter rolls in Fulton County. The former mayor of the city of Sandy Springs, Eva Galambos, is still on the voter rolls in Fulton County. So,
Harry Geisinger,
yes,
how long ago did he pass away?
it's a
Representative Geisinger?
number of years ago.
He's still on the voting rolls in
Yes, he
Fulton
is.
County?
Yes.
6 years ago, he passed away.
And Eva Galambos has been a number of
Well,
years
we
now,
all know
too.
Harry. We served with him.
Yes,
Yeah, thank you.
you're welcome. So we do think that the voter rolls need to be updated. And the reason for that is legal voters should be on the voter rolls. If you're not a legal resident of the state of Georgia, or frankly, if you have passed away, then you should no longer be on the voter rolls at that point. And so we do think we do need to strengthen that, because the counties alone, some of the counties, I want to note, some of the counties are not updating their voter rolls. The next thing is transparency and observation. It is extremely important, again, for confidence from both sides, that folks can see an open, transparent process. I will note again, in Fulton County, there was litigation which I was a part of from the election day on January 5th, where the poll observers were not allowed to be within 25 feet, and it was through opaque glass. A lawsuit was filed, and the Fulton County Superior Court judge ruled in favor of observation. Unfortunately, that decision was not followed. It took 5 hours to allow access. Those are the kind of things that make people have doubts about a system. So we need to have a system where all parties, the two major parties, Libertarian Party as well, feel like they have equal and open access and have a transparent election. That is something that helps restore confidence in election. Again, I spoke to 2018 and the results that happened there. We're speaking to the results of 2020. It's the same kind of thing. We, no matter where we sit politically, we need to all have confidence in our system.
Counselor, I'm going to give you some time to wrap up.
Yes, sir. The final issue that I want to bring up is the voting machines. We all know that during the testimony, when the current voting machine came into being, there was a lot of concerns about the system. There is concerns about the fact that it scans QR codes. That was something that was found by Democrats, by Republicans. We do think that one way that we can help restore some confidence in the system would be through the auditing process. There is some concerns about Pro V&V and their relationship with Dominion being their largest customer, and that if there was a third-party audit by another company or just by multiple companies, that might help to restore confidence as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This concludes my testimony. I'm open for any questions you may have.
You do have a question from Representative Burnow.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming. I have 3 questions.
Sure.
One is that if you stated that we should follow New York's example with the 8 excuses for unable to obtain an absentee ballot.
Yes.
Okay, so if we do that, then we go back to having long lines. So what do you suggest that we do to alleviate having those long lines again? Do you think that maybe we should extend early voting? You said that in person was the best.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say this, our task force recommended, we do think that we want to have standardization. We do think that House Bill 531 takes a very large step to standardization. However, we think Sunday voting should be part of that. We think that we should have Monday through Friday voting for 3 weeks, 1 day of Saturday voting and 1 day of Sunday voting in all counties, and make that across the state. Now, I do understand, and I will defer in a moment because the person that's going to be speaking after me has a little bit more familiarity with this issue, but I do think that there needs to be at least a little bit of flexibility, because we have heard loud and clear, and I heard the testimony from Friday, that it is more difficult for some of the smaller counties to handle this versus the larger metro counties. But I do think if you have 3 weeks of early voting with a Saturday and a Sunday, that you will get a significant amount of people during those early voting times. And prior to this election, only 5% of people used absentee ballots. Post-COVID, which I hope, some people say that by April, we're going to be to herd immunity. I hope that's the case. That may be a little bit optimistic, but at some point we are going to be through COVID. And I do think that some ways we're going to return a little bit to the prior ways people voted. And so I do think that you can accommodate that if we also take into account having the right early vote locations. I will defer to my election board member, subcommittee task member, because he can speak a little bit more to this, but I do agree with you with your concern.
Okay. and,
Representative Ellis,
can
you
I
have-
just ask
go
one
ahead,
more?
go ahead.
Okay. Did you all find evidence of that, those two people you all were talking about that have been dead and their names are still on the roll? Nobody vote. Does anybody vote?
Oh,
vote them?
I don't have evidence that they
Oh,
voted.
okay.
No. I didn't
Thank
mean to imply that. I just mean that they're still on the voter rolls.
All right, thank you.
Representative Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned about the task force. Who was primarily on that task force?
Well, we had a lot of different people, election board members, election lawyers.
Were all these people GOP or
Well,
was it nonpartisan?
The recommendations were primarily from Republicans. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate you being here today, Mr. Carver.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, next we'll go to Zoom. Mr. Joseph Kirk. Mr. Kirk, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, Mr. Kirk, we sure can. Good to have you today. Please introduce yourself, tell us who you're with, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Kirk. I'm the election supervisor in Bartow County. I've been involved in elections since 2001 and been in Bartow County since 2007. To give you all some background, we have about 75,000 voters, 17 election day polling places, up to 4 advanced voting sites, and then we used 5 drop boxes last year throughout the county. Before I continue, I want to give you a disclaimer. What I'm about to say are my views, not my boards or my counties or any of the organizations I'm affiliated with. These are all my personal opinions, but they are backed up by almost 2 decades of election administration. In general, talking about last year, I learned 2 major lessons. One is that no matter what, the election has to continue. And as election administrators, no matter if it's a pandemic or hurricane threats, we need some flexibility in order to do our jobs in those situations. And the other thing about emergencies is a shortage of poll workers is every bit as bad as a facility going down or being blown away by a tornado or something. And not just poll workers, but experienced poll workers that understand the process, the equipment, the voter registration, advanced voting, all that. The other is, in thinking about last year, that the things that are really important to be moving forward, and I think the way we can fix a lot of the mistrust that's out there is through transparency and engagement. No matter what processes we change right now, procedures, if no one's there to watch them, no one's going to trust them. And to give you some real world examples, I personally believe that signature comparisons worked well for us in the past, but folks could for absentee ballots, but people weren't there to see it, and therefore they don't believe that it happens the way it needed to. Or LNA testing or the audits that I've conducted, if no one's there to watch, it doesn't really have a lot of benefit. And if folks aren't engaged enough to come watch, no amount of anything is going to change that. Going through the bill, sort of a few sections that caught my interest, and I appreciate y'all hearing from me today. About sections 1 and 5 about outside money in elections. I understand the point you're making. I have no strong feelings about it. We didn't use that grant money last year. I have the good fortune of being in a county that prioritizes funding for my department. I'm very appreciative of that. But I'm concerned about local partnerships. I have folks that donate facilities to us, that donate, say, flips on electronic signs. I even had one local business donate umbrellas when it rained for us to pass out to voters in line. And I would hate for this bill to prevent us from having these local partnerships where they can donate to us in kind within the community. Sections 6 and 9, where it deals with no lines over an hour and changes the 1 per 250 requirement. Those are great changes. Thank you very much. The only thing I'd ask is we separate municipal general elections to give you, again, real world examples. The city of Cartersville has over 13,000 voters, but in the last 2 general elections, less than 1,500 showed up to vote. So with the way the bill is currently written, I'd be putting out the same number of equipment for a municipal general election as I would for a presidential election, at least the way I read the bill. Talking about section 11, where it prevents us from sending out absentee ballots the week before the election, I would ask there be some kind of emergency provision. Folks have a legitimate need to still have a ballot mailed to them because of the last minute emergency, be included in the bill. And the other thing I wanted to mention about the changes we're making to our absentee laws, and this goes more to ballots than applications, but just requiring PII to identify a voter. I see a concern with that. Besides the fact that some folks' signature changes over time, most signature mismatches we see are caused by somebody else in the household, say a parent, a spouse, signing the application or ballot, mostly the ballot for the voter. And rather than preventing that, this actually makes it easier for them to do that because their family's going to have that information. Whereas, say, a senior care facility has that information for their residents and can just fill it in for them. So I'm not sure what the solution there is. Maybe we still need to look at the signatures in some way, shape, or form. But I am concerned about that. And putting in copy the ID, of course, wouldn't solve that either. Talking about section 12, the drop boxes were a great tool that served us very well in our community. If we do continue to use them, I'd ask they do remain outside, even under observation. But if you want people to be able to turn in ballots to an advanced voting site, I think the easiest way to accomplish that goal, the cheapest way to accomplish that goal, is to empower the poll managers to accept those ballots rather than having a whole other position where someone's observing a box, have to buy a special piece of equipment. We have secure containers we can deposit the ballots in once they're turned into us. But rather than having this whole procedure outlined in code in this bill, if you don't want to have drop boxes outside, you don't want to have them available 24/7, which I personally did like, just empower the poll workers to take the ballots. Talking about section 13, those are great changes. I love instant runoff voting for Ocala runoffs. That will really make things easier for us. I was going to talk about section 15, but thank you for changing that to 14 days. That gives us more flexibility. I would mention that going into January, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that I have up to 4 advanced voting locations. I have 2 that are open for every single election, 1 for 3 weeks and 1 for at least a week. And then we'll table that decision sometimes to open the last 2 depending on turnout. And in January, we didn't vote to open those last 2 until we saw the turnout for that January runoff. But again, 14 days is a great change to that. Section 16, I think Tawny spoke last week about having to count ballots starting the week before the election. I would echo some of his comments. In the election I'm conducting right now, I've issued 2 ballots in the mail so far. If we have to start counting those ballots the Monday prior to the second Monday prior to the election, not only does it raise some financial concerns for the county, it also raises some privacy concerns for the voters. If we only scan 1 or 2 at a time, there's a report off the server that could generate a batch of a report that would show the results for each individual batch. Only scanning 1 or 2 ballots at a time really shows how those voters voted. Section 17, training for poll watchers, is just a great idea. That's a great change. Takes pressure off of me because I usually train my poll watchers or offer to train them. So thank you very much for that. As far as section 18 goes, prohibits gifts to people in line. I would ask that the county be exempt from that. The way I read it right now, it prevents me from giving out water to voters in line. And there are elections where they're lined up for my building. It's 100 degrees outside. I need a way to provide those voters water and something else they may need. But I do see the point of not having outside groups doing that. As far as section 22 goes, bipartisan duplication teams, that is a great change. Thank you very much for that. And then talking about section 23, which changed the certification deadline. Mr. Chairman, I noticed at the beginning of all this, you mentioned that we need to certify the results before we can audit the results. And I would respectfully disagree. I have in fact conducted pre-certification audits very successfully. I did a full hand audit after our January runoff before we certified those results. And it worked very, very well. We have to finish our canvassing process before we do the audit. We need to know how many ballots we have, where the ballots are. There's a lot of legwork we do before those audits, but doing them pre-certification does work. Now, if you want to certify first and then conduct the audit, I'm all for that. I mean, that's works as well, but not every audit will be for a statewide election. I'm planning to audit, if not every election I conduct, most every election I conduct here locally. I'm going to conduct an audit for the special election for the city of Carswell I'm conducting right now. And what the law currently says is as soon as I certify the results, I'm supposed to get those ballots over to the clerk of court and municipal clerk to put into retention. And if we just have to certify before we audit the election, I would ask for an additional, say, grace period or some kind of verbiage in law to allow me to hold on to the ballots until the completion of the audit, should we choose to conduct an audit on the county level or local level. The other thing I was going to mention about that is I know we're moving back towards a 28-day runoff period. I would echo some of the comments from last week where, maybe 5 or 6 weeks to give us time to do recounts, to give us time to do audits before we're jumping into the next election. Maybe not the huge timeframe we have right now, not another certification deadline or registration deadline, but another week or two to let me do my job and do it well to give that public confidence. The last thing I wanted to mention, based on your comments at the beginning of today, talking about the security paper, as y'all are considering this, one thing I wanted to mention to you is the cost of that paper, just so you have it. Right now, letter size security paper costs the counties 13 cents a page, and larger paper costs more. And just to remind you, we have to order 10% of paper ballots for emergencies for the polling places. Right now, ballots cost me 35 cents a piece. So adding 10, 20 cents to that cost per ballot will add up quickly. But I'm not trying to weigh in on whether or not it's necessary. I just want you to have that cost for your deliberation. That's all my comments today. I stand ready to answer questions, or if not, I hope you all have a wonderful day and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Kirk. We appreciate you being here today. Thank you very much. You've appeared before us before and had some good information and input, and we thank you for your work in Bartow County.
Thank you.
Okay, next we will go to Miss Elizabeth Tannis. Representative Smyre, Alexander, and Burris requested. Miss Tannis, are you with us via Zoom? Miss Elizabeth Tannis. Miss Tannis, I understand that we can see you on our laptop up here, but we can't hear you. Are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go. Miss Tannis, good to have you. Please introduce yourself, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
All right, and I'm going to check again. Chairman, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
Thank you so much. All right, I am Beth Tannis, and I am litigation counsel for Fair Fight Action. I'm going to make my comments brief today and focus on a particular provision of HB 531 that we oppose in connection with each major kind of voting in Georgia. Fair Fight Action has already submitted written comments that address particular provisions of HB 531, including these, and that is, of course, a much more comprehensive treatment of these provisions. So I'm going to start with voting by mail. HB 531 would reinstate the old and unlawful requirement that Georgians provide their dates of birth on the absentee ballot envelope and would require absentee ballots to be rejected if that date of birth is omitted or inconsistent with the date of birth information on file for the voter. The Georgia legislature eliminated this provision just 2 years ago, this date of birth provision. That was a part of HB 316, and it eliminated that provision for good reason. It was a violation of the Voting Rights Act. And because of that, 2 federal courts in November of 2018 enjoined Georgia election officials from rejecting absentee ballots based on omitted or inaccurate date of birth information. There's simply no justification for reinstating this unlawful requirement into the Georgia election code. I'm going to focus next on early in-person voting. As Reverend Woodall made very clear on this, the outlawing of Sunday voting and the restriction of Saturday voting to just one Saturday in that early voting period will have a disparate impact on Black voters and voters of color. And he provided many of the statistics on that. In general, many working people need to be able to vote on the weekends. And this restriction will have a greater effect on voters of color, which of course raises some serious constitutional and Voting Rights Act issues. Third and finally, I want to focus on in-person voting on Election Day. On that provision of 531 that would ban voting by provisional ballots for voters who go to the wrong precinct, but in the county where they live. This, of course, is a major departure from current law, and there's no justification for it. It's not appropriate to assume that a voter can simply travel to another precinct and vote. That response wrongly assumes that all these voters have access to cars, that they've got access to public transportation, and that they'd have time to do it, that they don't have time constraints for family responsibilities or employment responsibilities. And these problems are especially acute in rural areas where those distances between precincts are large and in densely populated counties with significant traffic delays. There is no voter fraud problem in Georgia that justifies HB 531's broad, multifaceted crackdown on voting. There is no administrative burden on Georgia election officials that can't be solved in ways that don't disenfranchise or burden voters. For example, better planning, better training, better supervision, better enforcement of the existing election laws. Nor will HB 531 enhance voter confidence in Georgia's election system. To the contrary, it will breed well-deserved cynicism. We've just seen 2 elections in Georgia with unprecedented turnout and virtually no voter fraud, as demonstrated by the recounts and audits that took place. That's good news, yet HB 531 treats it as bad news. Voters are not the enemy of democracy, they're its lifeblood. We urge that HB 531 not be passed. Thank you, and I'm of course happy to answer any questions.
Counselor, thank you for being here today. We appreciate your presentation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see, Mr. John Nat. Joel, I'm sorry, Joel Nat. Joel, good to see you today. Thanks for being with us. Please introduce yourself, tell us who you're with, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
May I take this off?
Yes, you may. Yeah, our speaker has said that if anyone is speaking at the microphone, they can take the mask off if they would like to.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Joel Nat. I'm a resident of Forsyth County. I live in House District 24, which is representing Gillian's district. I'm a member of the Forsyth County Board of Elections, and I'm appointed by the Republican Party as one of the 2 Republicans. There are 2 Democrats and a nonpartisan appointed by the courts. In addition to that, I am a cybersecurity professional by trade. I've been in that industry 20 years. I've dealt with everything from cyber auditing of PII to HIPAA to everything else you can imagine. So I think I'm a little bit of an expert when it comes to computers technology. I want to talk about 531 in several different pieces, Mr. Chairman, and there was a lot of good conversation that's already occurred on it. First, I want to talk about voter registration a little. As you've already heard from Councilor Carver as an example, there's a need in Georgia across the board. We've been dealing with election to election to election. We have election going on still that preventing us from cleaning up voter rolls. Voter rolls are the #1 piece of our election. You need to be able to have faith that people are properly registered. We use things like the federal national voter, a part of the National Voter Rights Act is Motor Voter. We had it when it first came into Georgia, an opt-in where the DMV would ask you, do you want to register to vote? We at some point changed it to an opt-out where you now have to tell them, oh, don't update my voter registration. And in truth, it's a wrong question being posed. Department of Motor Vehicles really should be an opt-in, such as Motor Voter allows it to be, but it should be, would you like us to update your voter registration or register you to vote? And the key is there, update your registration. That means you've moved, you changed your last name because you got married, or you got went to the courts and legally changed your name in some way. Those are the reasons to update if you're already registered. Creates confusion. And now I believe, honestly, any election official will tell you every time someone goes to do a driver's license update, they get an update. I updated my license 2 years ago, and my director calls me and says, "Oh, you updated, you told them to send it through." That's how I found out it was an opt-out. I didn't tell them anything, but they sent through an update to my voter registration. So that's a critical aspect. That's one step. The other piece of that is we currently, under the statute and under the State Board of Elections, the Secretary of State receives periodically updates of death certificates in the state. But that's only in the state. We don't cross-reference it as well as we should with things like Social Security records, other areas, to purge people that have passed away. Those are just small pieces. To the point about IDs, I want to point out something, with all due respect to the president of the NAACP. Anybody that needs to get a federal SNAP, they have to produce ID to qualify for SNAP. So you have to have ID for everything, banks, everything, including food stamps, Mr. Chairman. So I don't think asking us to have IDs to vote is wrong. On the subject of absentee by mail, you guys are doing a great job in rolling back the dates, in my humble opinion. We had unamounted tons of applications this year. And I'm going to tell you personal experience, and I'm not speaking for Forsyth County, I'm not speaking, but personal observation. My election staff had tons come in every day, 2, 3, 4 from the same person. So it added work to them. There needs to be a little bit of logic here. There needs to be reliance. The U.S. Postal Service takes 3 to 5 days. I live in Forsyth County. For me to mail a letter from my house to my next door neighbor, just to my next door neighbor, if I put it in my mailbox, gets picked up by my mail person, they take it there to the post office, it comes down here to Atlanta to Central Clearing, then goes back to the same post office. It's a 3-day process before my next door neighbor gets that letter. At best, could be longer. Moving it back like you are is excellent. But to that, I want to talk about the drop boxes. Absentee ballots are great. Drop boxes were a necessity of the year. But here's the problem, and it's 2 words or 3 words: chain of custody. I can tell you, and I spoke to my peer in Gwinnett County. She is the chairman of the Board of Elections this year, and she told me at Tuesday's meeting, they learned they had 100 absentee ballots found in the last 2 weeks in the drop boxes. They don't know if those were dropped before Election Day or after Election Day. There's no chain of custody anywhere in these drop boxes to know how many ballots were dropped off when they were swiped at any point. And what I mean by swiped is picked up by the staff and brought back. So I can say, in my county, we only had 1 box. But if you had multiple boxes, how do you know that there were only 100 ballots in the last 24 hours dropped into a box? Or how do you know that there's 1,000 ballots? There's the problem. You can have chain of custody from the moment I take possession of the box as an election official and bring it to the election office to be processed. But if I don't know how many I'm taking out of that, how many I should be taking out, whether they're for the current election or a prior election, I have no starting number. I have no control factor. Without that control, those drop boxes might as well be as useful as the mailbox down the block that has been sealed by former President Obama. U.S. postal mailboxes were sealed under his jurisdiction for safety reasons because people could throw things into them, and it was a fear of dynamite. It was an executive order that he had issued. So moving on, in-person voting. we talk about advanced voting, and we talk about these, I'm going to say 16 days. There's 3 weeks, 5 days a week, plus 1 Saturday in the current statute of law. Some counties added Sundays, some added the second Saturday, some added 2 Sundays. And I'm first, I want everyone to go on record. I believe in Sunday voting. I'm Jewish. And I'm tired of hearing as a Jew that my religion doesn't matter because we only vote on Saturdays. I'm sorry, but that's my personal position, that I feel that I'm being discriminated against personally. Having said that, though, I believe that you need to at least have 1 Sunday vote. If you have Saturday, you need to have Sunday. Respect all religions equally in that regard. Okay, to that though, there's a little statute that's not in here, and I'm going to call you all to Chapter 21-2-404. Mr. Chairman, the gentleman to your right has a copy of the gray book. If 404 says a employer, upon proper notification, shall give their employee 2 hours at the beginning of their shift or at their end of their shift to vote on election day. If you're going to have advanced voting in person, you need to expand 404 to include those days as an employer. And honestly, I should be able, if I'm voting, if I need to go vote on a Tuesday that's 2 weeks before election day, or on a Saturday because I'm working, I need to be able to say to my boss, I need to take 2 hours and go vote. 404 only says for election day. Please, if you're going to make substitution, consider adding that to expand that scope of 404. This way, you're balancing it out, because then it's truly fair if election day versus advanced. Hours of operation are great to say, oh, you're going to do 9 to 5. My county elections, currently, our office is open 8:30 to 4:30. They're open, that's the standard county operations. We voted as a board 8 to 5 for all of our election days, uniformity across the board as how we operated. Some counties voted 7 to 7, everything was different. We need consistency, we really do. And the reason I say that is, here living in Atlanta, there's 11 Alive, CBS 46, to name 2 stations, the AJC. They're gonna publish for Fulton County, but I watch it in Forsyth County. And if I'm not paying attention, I may misinterpret and think I can go vote also these longer time. And thus I create disenfranchising of my voters. I ask you, and I support that you want to create consistency, but think about it in the big picture. Think about it from a budgeting perspective. Those small counties, and I'm going to screw up this county, I always do, Trafalgar, to Ferry, somebody help me.
Oliver.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I can never, but they're a small county in South Georgia. They don't have the budget of Fulton, Cobb, Gwinnett, even Forsyth or Cherokee, but they need to be considered as well. You mentioned today that you're doing a change on paper ballots. You're doing a substitution to secure paper. As a cybersecurity professional and somebody that used to work for Hewlett-Packard Inc., the election official that talked a few moments ago is correct. You're talking a very strict cost. You can't go to Office Depot or to Walmart and buy that paper. You have to have very secure. The U.S. federal government uses it for printing out currency. But on that, you also need to establish a sole source vendor. You need to task the Secretary of State, if you're going to do this, to establish one vendor and get that vendor for maximum cost efficiency, knowing that you're now purchasing for the entire state. One of the other points that were raised by one of the previous speakers is auditing. I honestly believe that the risk limiting audit needs to be across all elections, primaries and general elections. A risk limiting audit needs to be there. I think that restored a little bit of confidence. It didn't restore 100% confidence in the machines, but it did restore some. The ballot itself does have some flaws in it. I tell you, as a cybersecurity professional, a QBR code is scary. That's that little check mark thing. For those that are listening that don't know what it is, I know you all do know, but That is a very
Mr. Nat, I want to give you time to wrap up.
okay.
And then we have one
I have
question.
just two items.
Okay.
So you need to look to change that. Finally, I would like to ask you all one personal item. The FAWA, which is the Federal Overseas Voters. I ask you to mandate only for federal voters, not for UOCAVA voters, that they must send a copy of their passport when they vote. Hear me out. If you are a permanent resident overseas, that means you're not coming back to Georgia. You may own land here. You may be entitled by Federal National Voter Rights Act to vote in federal elections, but you need to produce that you're still a US citizen. And a passport has to be maintained. Federal law, international law requires that if I'm claiming US citizenship, even if I'm living overseas, I have to maintain a US passport. That means once every so many years, I need to visit the embassy of the country I'm residing in. And that is important. If you, whatever you do with IDs, that's something that's not in here. I'm sorry I went all over the place and everything, but I wanted to get several points out.
Representative Burnell?
Yes, thank you for coming. I just had one question. You mentioned that code, and I'm glad that you did, where an employer has to let his employees off either 2 hours before, 2 hours after. The only concern I have with that, if I'm an hourly worker, am I still going to get paid?
The statute currently does not mandate that.
Okay.
That is the employer's discretion. I would hope the employer would work around, because it requires you to advance tell. I can't walk in today and say, if you were my boss, I'm taking 2 hours at the end of the day to go vote today. You have to give advance notice. So hopefully they'll work your schedule appropriately if you're an hourly worker, but they have to give you the time. It's a state law. And I think it's a poorly educated law personally. And I as an election person, I feel I'm partially to blame for it, not letting people know, but everyone in this room is also equally on all sides of the aisle, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Chairwoman Smith?
Thank you. Over here, sir. Thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious, could you compare a chain of custody between a drop box to a U.S. mailbox?
I can't truly compare that to some extent. I wish my uncle was still here and alive. He was a postal inspector. He could give you a lot better detail. But I can tell you a drop box and in a post office, if they see like they clean out the box and suddenly 2 hours later they have to go clean it out and there's 1,000 ballots in there, they're going to report something egregious to the election officials saying, hey, look, we just cleaned out this box at this post office and there was 1,000 more ballots dropped into it. But the post office has delivery responsibilities. They can't tell you where they all came from. We, on the other hand, should know how many ballots are being dropped off to us, like we know how many voters walk into our polls. Whether they vote or not, I can tell you, and every other election poll should be able to tell you this many people have walked in. It's in the current codes that we have to maintain. We have to maintain those statistics.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chairman Smyer?
Sir, you said you had one drop box.
Yes, Forsyth County, we only had one drop box.
Let me ask you a question. If you're an election supervisor, right?
No, well, technically by the local legislation, I'm one of 5.
Okay.
All 5 of us make
Member
up.
of the Board of Elections,
Yeah.
I believe,
Okay.
Chairman Smyer.
Under your experience, and you covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Do you favor a drop box indoors? Would that be sufficient for oversight, or what?
I think if you have a proper box, which is a box that's keeping track of how many ballots are being dropped into it, so you have control. I think an outside box is fine if it's properly monitored by cameras. And I'm going to point to Colorado for a moment, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Colorado has in their statute for their drop boxes, video has to be maintained for 25 months. It has to be held for 25 months. We just hold it until, I don't know what the SBE did not say how long it had to be held, but it has to be held in Colorado. So I think with proper controls, an outside box is just as powerful as an inside box if the controls are there. And that includes knowing how many ballots are placed into it that are being cleared out. I can pull out a box and say, oh, here's 100 ballots. And as I point out, Gwinnett County found 100 ballots afterwards. These 100 voters are getting letters that say, we got your ballot after the fact. You've been credited with voting, but we can't do anything about it.
So you're not unequivocally opposed to boxes. You just prefer to have some sort of
They need to have
oversight.
control. If they can't
Oversight?
have control, if they can't have proper control, they shouldn't be. And yes, to the other chairman's point about US Postal, you have to take 99% of the people have to take a moment to put a stamp on it if they're going to the post office.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Last question, Representative Burnow.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to let Chairman Smith know that Representative Sheila Nelson is a retired postmaster, so she could probably explain that to you. You're welcome.
That's good to know.
Thank you for being here
Mr.
today.
Chair, can I add one small thing?
Wrap up, go ahead.
I realized one last thing as I was talking here. Training, it's great that you guys are putting it in there as a professional. It still needs to be vetted by somebody in whether it's the oversight committees of the House and Senate or the Secretary of State. And the reason is, with all due respect to the Democrats, they did training in Forsyth County, and their training included the ability to turn on their cell phone and point it at my managers' desks during the election, which is against the law.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, we have committee members, we have worked our way through all the witnesses that you requested. And as I mentioned, the chair would be lenient with the time if a member of this committee requested a witness, and we were on both sides. So now I want us to move back into that 3 to 5 minutes, preferably 3 minutes, as we work our way through the rest of the witness, because we have a few to get through. Okay, Kay Rebolt. Going once? Okay, all right. Kay, thanks for coming today. Did I pronounce that right? Rebolt?
It is Rybolt, but that's
Rybolt,
okay.
okay.
Yes,
I
yes.
got close. Welcome. Please tell us who you are and where you live, and if you're with a group, and we'd love to hear from you.
I'm Kay Rybolt, and I'm from Roswell, Georgia. And I'm not with a group unless you consider my family of 12, and they're pretty groupish, I will tell
I'd
you
say
that.
that's a pretty good group.
So it's just me. But I became concerned after the November election and all that was being said and all that was being done and reports that were being made. And I've never been involved in the election process other than to vote. And I did mostly campaigns in my career. And so on election day, I was pretty much involved in that. So I decided that I would really like to see for myself if some of these things that people were saying, were true and why they were saying these things. So I volunteered for everything. I volunteered to be a poll watcher. I volunteered to go and run errands. I volunteered for everything in the runoff. And I know you want me to keep this to 3 minutes. So I'm going to tell you about one thing that I think that I saw that has not been mentioned. And that was my trip to the Darnell Center when they were working on requests for absentee ballots. Now, how many of you have been to the Harriet Darnell Center during the election process? Anybody? Well, I'm just going to encourage you to go, because I went down there and I was told that nothing was going on regarding elections there. And so I said, but I was told that there is. And so finally they brought out a nice lady whose name I'm not going to mention because I don't want to put her job in jeopardy, but she got a guy named Brian on the phone from somewhere, State Department, Secretary of State's office, I assume. And he said, oh no, there's nothing going on down there regarding elections. And so I said, okay. So we hung up and I looked at this young lady and I said, why did they ask me to come here if there's nothing going on regarding elections? And I truly don't know what got into her, but she said, well, I am working on absentee ballot request forms. I went, oh, well, could I see the process? And so she took me back and walked into a room that is huge, huge room, banquet room. Everywhere in that room were postcards in bins that had been obviously mailed out to people that come back, probably the first step in determining if a person's name needs to be removed from the voter list. There was paper everywhere. On one side of the room, people were working on alphabetizing, she told me. On the other side of the room, people were at computers and they were looking at absentee ballot request forms. So I said, can you show me the process? And she did. She went through each one in a stack that she had. And the two that stuck out to me were these. One was the lady who had requested an absentee ballot for her mother. And she said, now that I would send an absentee ballot to her. I said, well, would you check to see if the lady that's asking for it is a voter? Well, no. I said, well, is there some form that will say if this mother or daughter has the right to request that form? And she said, well, no, there's not that. And I said, okay, well, thank you. I said, well, would you look at my record?
Ms.
And would you,
Rybalt, I want to give you time to wrap up.
and would you see if about my signature, because I've heard so much about signatures and giving us, good feelings about the fact that signatures are going to be looked at. And she pulled up my signature and she looked at me and she says, Miss Kay, I would reject you. And I was like, well, I agree with you, because my signature looked like something that I might write at the pharmacy when I pick up my prescription. And I said, but I received a ballot. So how did I receive a ballot if my signature looks like that? And she said, I don't know, but I would reject you. So my question to you is, and when you're working on this, is if you would consider that, because if I filled out that form, mailed it back in, someone else is looking at my signature on my ballot, would they reject me?
The bill in its current form moves from the signature as a verification process to a common number that 97% of Georgians have, and that's the driver's license.
That'd be great.
Thank you,
And
ma'am.
thank you so much for all your work on this bill. It is really needed. Thank you.
Thank you for coming today. We appreciate you being here. Ginger Bradshaw. Ms. Bradshaw, good to have you. You were hiding behind the pole too.
I was.
Yeah.
I'm going to be brief. A lot of my name's Ginger Bradshaw. I live in Fulton County. I live in Sandy Springs to be exact. A lot of the issues that are concerns or even things that I think are great that you're doing have been covered. I just had a couple things that I wanted to talk about. Y'all had mentioned in general talking about oversight and looking at line 818 and then 841 through 846. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I, like Kay, I observed the absentee ballots at the World Congress Center for Fulton County. And when I went down there, they had all these barricades up, and then they had these big blue shields up. And I asked the lady, Keisha, I said, we can't even see anything. And I said, what's with those blue barricades? And she said, I say barricades, things you put up around a computer for privacy. And she said, that's so you can't see that's where they were doing the military ballots. But all this I'm trying to say is I felt like they could have been building a warship back there and I wouldn't have known the difference because you couldn't get close enough. And there was a guy, Carter Jones, who was some sort of monitor. And my recommendation, and I'm not sure if that's what 818 and 841 and 846 mean, I think there should be a Republican, a Democrat, an independent that is behind the scenes so that they can really see the interactions of what's going on. And then another thing there that I found out was I watched everything. And then I asked Keisha, I said, how do the USBs or whatever it is that tallies the scans? I said, how do they get to the next place? And she said, well, I don't know. And evidently she had Ralph Jones on her headset because she says, Mr. Jones, this lady wants to know how the USBs get to the next place. And he said, well, a Dominion tech takes them. And I said, a Dominion tech takes them by himself? Because I have learned as a poll watcher that those things have to be, two people take it from the poll to wherever it goes. So I was really appalled at the lack of custody of all of those things. And then the other thing I'll be real quick about is, are there in here penalties? One of the things that I've been very irritated about is we've seen lots of voting irregularities, but there's been no resolution. We've seen dead voters vote. We've seen things that are not really what they're supposed to be, but there doesn't seem to be a real penalty. And then who would carry out if you see something that's wrong and it's determined that it's wrong? Well, if you see something that's wrong, what's the penalty for it? And then who's going to enforce that penalty? So that's something that I think is very important, because we've still got all these voter people that nobody seems to be investigating. So, but I want to thank
you,
y'all
ma'am.
very much for all your hard work. And I have to say, I'm against the voting machines. I'm probably going to lose that battle, but I do appreciate that you're trying to make them as accountable.
Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. We
Thank
appreciate you
you.
being here today. Barbara Hartman. Barbara Hartman. Okay. You were hiding behind the pole too. But you have on red and black, so we excuse you.
No, it's
because
red
that-
and navy, actually, red and navy.
We'll just call it
Okay.
red and black for these purposes. How about
Okay,
that?
red and black.
Okay,
How
go
about that? My
dogs.
husband went to Georgia Tech, though. Okay.
You can't have everything. So, all right.
My sons went to UGA.
I knew I sensed something good there. That's what it was. Go ahead, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, now, Mr. Carver and Mr. Nat, I think covered most of what I wanted to say, but I'm going to tell you that for over 25 years, I have been either a poll worker, poll manager, poll assistant manager. I've done it all. I've been a poll watcher and a poll monitor, and I've seen many, many changes. Some things I want to address is the lady who talked about birthdays on the absentee ballots. They're there for a purpose, and working in the poll, generally you have to have your birthday, and that's done for a purpose because it ensures that the right person gets the right ballot. If a son or another family member comes in with the same name, we check birthdays to make sure that we have the right person. Otherwise, the wrong person may vote, and they may not vote the same way that the right person wants to vote. Okay, now the other thing was the lack of time. If you don't have time, if you have time to go to a grocery store or to go anywhere, you have time in 3 weeks of early voting to vote, or you can absentee vote. And as far as drop boxes go, there were two attorneys that staked out and watched a drop box in Fulton County. And they said that they saw people coming in. You see these people coming in, if they have masks or they have a hoodie on, then you don't know who they are. I mean, you can't identify them even if you have a camera. And they were dropping in stacks of ballots. Alice Olenek is on the chairman of the board in Gwinnett County. She spoke at a meeting I attended, and we were discussing how that could happen. You can pay an orderly $500 or $5,000, or somebody who works in the nursing home getting a minimum wage, and they're going to do anything just about to get that extra money, because that might be the next payment on a house or an apartment or whatever. And that's a theory that could happen because we've seen it happen. One of our former House representatives was a poll watcher with me, and she took her mother, her elderly mother, to vote, and they told her that she had already voted, that she had turned in an absentee ballot, and she had not. Most of you know this person. I won't say her name now, but she did not say anything to the nursing home because she was afraid that something might happen to her mother. They might mistreat her mother because of this. When I was at the polls, when I was working, and also when I was poll watching, I saw people come in that were turned away until they had received an absentee ballot. They had not received an absentee ballot. When I was a poll monitor, watcher, whatever you want to call, counter, with a lady that's sitting in the back, I saw ballots that we were supposed to have the card stock ballots that are the absentee ballots. We were counting those, and they were not creased. And I held it up to the light. I said, look here, they're not, how can they be folded and mailed because they're not creased? I know one of the ladies at one of the hearings, I think it was a House hearing, said maybe they're duplicated. That's not true because duplicated ballots are duplicated from the BMD and on different machines. Most of you don't realize how ballots are duplicated. 106,000 were duplicated in Fulton County. That's absurd. There should be less than 1%. I asked the question when I was a poll watcher. I took Mr. Jones, asked him to come. I said, this looks suspicious. Can you explain it to me? Mr. Jones and I became good friends for 2 days because I kept asking him to explain. There were two ladies sitting at a table.
Hartman, I'm gonna give you time to wrap up.
They were actually voting other people's votes. And I said, how, Mr. Jones, do I know? I voted early because I'm a poll worker. How do I know they're not voting mine? And they are voting the way they want it voted. And he said, oh, that's easy. There's one on this end and one on that end. And this one takes the ballot and hands it down to the next one. And they say, oh, yeah, it's the same. Okay, there was no
Ms. Hartman,
oversight.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up, please.
Okay, and that's it. We need oversight. We need to make sure we get oversight from all the parties, especially with duplication.
Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate you coming today.
Thank you.
Adam Sweat. Adam Sweat. Mr. Sweat, good to see you. Welcome. Good to have you today. Please tell us who you're with, where you're from, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate
And you can leave your
having me.
mask on or take it off if you want to while
I'll
you're
do,
at the mic.
I'll do this.
Okay.
I appreciate you having me. My name is Adam Sweat, and I work for Pro Georgia. We are a 503c nonprofit, and we fight for, we protect and enhance voting rights, work to do that, especially in communities that are disenfranchised or unrepresented. So I would like to urge this committee to reject HB 531. The provisions of HB 31 individually burden the right to vote. Collectively, these burdens are exceptionally exacerbated. For instance, Section 11 of HB 531 would heighten identification requirements, burdening voters who can often face challenging accessing DMV offices or photocopiers, or even have the ability to pay for photocopies. Internet access and frequently have difficulty accessing a polling place to vote in person. Section 12 would severely limit the availability of accessible, equitable, and safe drop boxes. Section 15 would severely limit the total number of advanced voting hours and days. The combined impact of HB 531's ID restrictions on accessing an absentee ballot, drastic reductions in early voting, and drop box limitations severely burdens the right to vote by limiting access to the ballot, especially for racial minority, low income, elderly, and disabled voters. I'll share one personal story with you before I end my remarks. I think a lot about my grandmother who voted in the 2020 election. She's voted in every election since 1952. Thankfully, she lives with my parents who were able to help her access a absentee ballot the first time. It's not just about resources, it's about people who know how to even understand these processes. So it is our call that you vote against HB 531 and you protect everyone's right to vote.
Thank you for being here today, sir.
Thank you.
Sarah Tyndall Gazal, maybe? Sarah, did I mispronounce your last name? No, that was actually correct. Oh, I'm getting. Even the blind hog finds a root every now and then. Sarah, good to have you today. Thank you. And please tell us who you're with, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Chairman Fleming, members of the committee. My name is Sarah Tyndall Gazelle. I'm an attorney, former candidate for the 2020 general election, served for nearly 2 years as the voter protection director for the Democratic Party of Georgia. Prior to that, I spent more than 10 years supporting and observing elections and working to resolve conflicts in countries across the world for the Carter Center. Today, I'm here representing myself as a voter, but based on my experience in all of these roles. 3 years ago, I was closely involved with the SAFE Commission, and I traveled the state, observing and participating in those meetings that discuss the future of Georgia's voting system. 2 years ago, I offered testimony about HB 316. In both of these forums, I spoke about the risks of reduced voter trust in the integrity of our voting process and the dangers that such mistrust can breed. In November, I published an op-ed in the AJC warning of the hazards of amplifying misinformation and how that undermines faith in our democratic institutions. And sadly, this warning was not heeded, and the perpetuation of the big lie has led to political violence and death. It's in this context that an unprecedented number of election bills have been proposed, purportedly to increase public trust in our elections. Elections are about voters and making sure that members of our community have an equitable opportunity to make sure their voices are heard and that their choices are reflected in our elected officials and in their policy choices. The strength of our democratic institutions relies solely on the public's faith in the processes by which they're brought about. I've observed elections all over the world. I can tell you, elections that are trusted by voters are ones in which the process is fair and transparent. Unfortunately, this bill lends very little to either of those aspects. The fairness aspect has really been covered quite well by my colleagues here. Changes in this law appear to be designed with surgical precision to limit and block access to the ballot, critically, primarily Black voters. The numbers bear out the disparate impact that this bill in particular will have. Eliminating drop boxes for all intents and purposes, restricting early voting by 3 of the 4 possible days, pushing the absentee application process into a very compressed period of time, and disenfranchising voters who inadvertently may appear at the wrong precinct on election day, sometimes under the express direction of a poll worker, are all methods designed to limit voter access. Transparency is the other issue. There is not much in this bill that will enhance transparency so that voters can understand the electoral process, although examples in other states really abound. Limiting the time that counties have to conduct a thorough reconciliation and canvass of votes is antithetical to transparency. Creating bipartisan duplication panels for ballots that must be copied is a positive step, as is mandating training for poll workers. I spent countless hours in Cobb County explaining to GOP poll watchers exactly what they were looking at and what they were watching. The Secretary of State's Fulton County consultant, who came from the International Republican Institute, submitted an extensive report based on hundreds of hours of observation. It noted process changes that would improve the accuracy and efficiency in our electoral processes. Improved procedures for election officials would genuinely contribute to election integrity. A more robust ballot reconciliation and canvass process with bipartisan participation would both increase transparency and prevent issues that we saw in November, where counties only belatedly identified batches of ballots that were not reflected in the vote totals.
Council, I want to give you time to wrap up.
Eliminating QR codes on ballot summaries and moving to an OCR technology would also increase voter confidence once those systems are certified. But most importantly, educating our voters on election processes, how voters cast their ballots and how they're counted would strengthen voter confidence in our systems and in our institutions. The focus of this bill should be how votes are done, not who can vote, which is where the focus seems to be now. Thank you very much for your
Thank
time
you,
and
ma'am.
attention.
We appreciate you being here today. Gail Trayer. Okay. Susie Voiles. Good to see you, ma'am. Happy to see you today. Please tell us who you're
Good to
with
see-
and where you live. We'll be happy to hear from you.
I'm Susie Voiles. I'm from Sandy Springs in Fulton County. Many of the points that I was going to bring up, I'm not going to repeat, but one note about provisional ballots that I do think is very important. Georgia law does say that, and this is posted in every poll, that a voter must vote within the precinct in which they reside. And there's an important reason for that. On the provisional ballots, you know, you've got your major offices of governor, president, whatever. But down ballot, you have your offices. You all live in House districts. And if that person is in the wrong precinct, it is your votes that are being either minimized or lost. My former poll was SSO2 A and B. It was changed 2 weeks before. So many of the people went to what turned into SS19 A and B. And the Sandy Springs reps were on SSO2A, but not B. And likewise, they were, and Matt Dollar was on one, and my current rep and her predecessor were on the other. Many people voted for the wrong rep, which meant that vote didn't count. So that is one reason that it is essential that people understand. Yeah, I can receive a provisional ballot, but it doesn't mean that my down ballot offices are going to reflect who I would like to represent me, particularly in my House district or maybe even my Senate district. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate you being with us today. David Walbert. Mr. Walbert, good to have you with us today. We'd be happy to hear from you. Just tell us where you live and if you're with a particular group, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm live in Atlanta, live in Buckhead. My law office is on 14th Street, and I come here today as someone, a private citizen though, and a lawyer who I think has more experience litigating and trying election cases in the state of Georgia than probably the next 10 lawyers put together. I've represented the state of Georgia, special counsel from the Attorney General. I've sued the state of Georgia for private groups, and I've argued in the Supreme Court, both for and against the state of Georgia in past cases. And I'd like to share from that experience just some of my observations of what the committee is faced with here. And you're faced with a terrible challenge because of the emotions and the perceptions that are out there that oftentimes don't fit with reality. I have two particular issues in the bill that I'd like to address. Before I do that, though, and that's going to be provisionals and the early voting question. One thing I would just suggest to your members of the committee here, Mr. Chairman, I've heard a lot today about potential. We heard the gentleman that was talking about absentee ballots and Jimmy Carter and Senator Baker's report about absentee ballots have the potential for fraud. And what's interesting to me is I've tried these cases. I've subpoenaed people. I've cross-examined them. We've heard today about this and that happened with absentee ballots, but the honest to goodness record of facts of what happened, we've had no problem with absentee ballots. As a matter of fact, we've had absentee ballots. I started voting in Georgia in the early 70s, and we've had absentee ballots ever since then, and it's never been a problem. For this committee to start restricting the ability to vote by absentee ballot because of a theoretical potential, what I suggest to you would be a grave mistake. Look at the facts, legislate based on what real problems exist, and deal with that. But to start restricting the most important and sacred thing that holds this country together, the right to vote, based on the thought that something could go wrong when it never has, I would suggest it would be a very serious travesty. You know, in that regard, I was in the Supreme Court of the United States on one occasion defending the state of Georgia on a voting case, a race case. And one of the justices asked me, well, how can you stand here and say that what the state of Georgia did in this case is the right thing when you've got the history in the state of Georgia on race of always doing the wrong thing? And the Supreme Court justice asked me that. If this committee does what is in this bill and the state of Georgia does these kind of things, we're taking that history one step further. We're giving the federal government every justification to come in and pass a strong additional federal legislation. We're begging the federal courts to come in and say, look, at one more time, Georgia's done the wrong thing by restricting the right to vote. So I would just suggest that look at any real problems that exist. You've got a heck of a problem because when we talk about perception of integrity and so on in the system and transparency, you can show the facts to a lot of people today and it makes no difference. They're going to have the same opinion regardless of what there is. So don't screw up the system on the theory of we're going to convince people that everything's hunky-dory because they're seeing more. That isn't going to happen. That's just not the sad world we live in today, and y'all know that quite well.
Counselor, I want to give you the ability to wrap up.
All right. Provisional ballots. The federal law specifically says explicitly that you must give to someone in the precinct a provisional ballot. If you pass this law that makes that illegal under state law, you are opening up your people, the poll workers, to lawsuits for violating federal law. Don't do it. Provisional ballots are extremely effective. People have the right to cast them. And when I represented Fulton County Board of Elections in a case, they had a lot of provisional ballots. And we presented to the then Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, that federal law requires this. And that was the end of the deal. Provisional ballots and early voting in particular, that is what has made our election system work recently instead of having these crazy lines. Do not cut back early voting, especially Sundays and Saturdays, which have a flagrant impact on the African-American community. Keep that. That is what makes our voting work. We have
Counselor, thank you for being here today.
one sentence, I'm going to add one sentence if I may. We
Go
have a
ahead.
much more complex system of voting today than we've ever had before because of the machines, the verifications, and so on. Early voting and absentee voting are essential to keep that system working. Please don't cut it back.
That was a compound run-on sentence.
Yeah, it was.
We appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
One more question, Your Honor.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you, sir. Dana Lloyd. Okay, I see you. You were behind one of the posts too. Ms. Lloyd, thank you for coming today. We'd be happy to hear from you. Please tell us where you're from and who you're with, and we'll listen to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dana Lloyd. I work for the Georgia Advocacy Office. It's Georgia's federally mandated protection and advocacy system. I'm a voter in DeKalb County as well. I'd like to highlight some concerns, some that have been brought by other folks here, but that specifically affect voters with disabilities. So we appreciate the opportunity to provide comments to the committee on the legislation proposed today, specifically House Bill 531. As Georgia's appointed protection and advocacy system, we are gravely concerned about the impact this proposed legislation will have on Georgians with disabilities. GAO envisions a Georgia where all people have value, visibility, and voice, and where even the most difficult and long-lasting challenges are addressed by ordinary citizens acting on behalf of each other, and where the perception of disability is replaced by the recognition of ability. In our work as a P&A, we consistently see the need for people with disabilities to have greater access to voting and civic engagement opportunities, not less. Georgia Advocacy Office works advocating on behalf of people to live full and meaningful lives within the state of Georgia, which includes ensuring access to free, equitable, accessible, and independent elections. The Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehab Act make clear that people who have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limit one or more major life activities, have a record of such impairment, or regarded of having that impairment, are considered a person with a disability and subject to the protections offered under these laws. Limiting who is eligible to request an absentee ballot based on physical disability alone is discriminatory. There are a variety of disabling conditions which are not physical in nature, conditions like anxiety, agoraphobia, autism, or processing delays that make voting by mail an accessible way to exercise one's right to vote. It is important to note that this bill is being proposed in a context with other legislation that will have the effect of limiting other alternatives to reporting to a polling place on a given day to cast a ballot. These limits to early voting, availability of drop boxes, and mobile voting will all have the impact of disenfranchising voters with disabilities throughout the state of Georgia. Proposed limits to early voting days and hours create barriers for people who have non-traditional employment schedules, unreliable access to transportation, including public transit, or who may be managing chronic conditions such as migraines, which are unpredictable. Having multiple opportunities to cast a ballot keeps citizens engaged in our representative democracy. Ballot drop boxes, I apologize. That's what I get for writing comments. Ballot drop boxes provide access for people who have challenges voting in polling places like churches that are exempt from ADA compliance. Mobile voting creates opportunities for people living in congregate nursing facilities to fully participate in the electoral process. Many residents may be unable to leave the facility for a variety of reasons and may also be under the age of 75 and not eligible to request an absentee ballot as proposed in this legislation. The proposals create an overlapping burden that narrows the opportunity for voters with disabilities to cast their ballot. The proposed legislation would impose restrictions that make the central activity of democratic society less accessible to voters with disabilities. These provisions are ill-conceived and would create tremendous administrative burden for local boards of election, and the state of Georgia, as legal challenges would certainly be brought. Ensuring the integrity of Georgia's elections is an important task, and our collective energy and efforts should be creating opportunities for every eligible voter to cast their vote without undue hurdles. We strongly object to this proposed legislation. It will wreak havoc on voting access in Georgia. We ask that you reject House Bill 531.
Thank you, Ms. Lloyd. We appreciate you coming today. Maureen. And Maureen, I'm going to let you pronounce your last name.
I thought that's why you weren't including me.
No, just going through the list.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank
Tell us who
you.
your
My
name.
name is Maureen Giannone. I'm here
Giannone.
as a
Good to have you.
resident of Georgia. And I also was a poll manager, assistant manager this past year, and have been working the polls since 2018. My concern for your bill, which I completely agree with, that there needs to be some more control over it, is the training and the qualifications that I have to go through in order to work on election day. I do not work on early voting. We spend probably 12 to 15 hours each election day, and we go through varying days of training for each election cycle. This particular year, I went through 5 of them. And we go through an enormous amount of processes to ensure that the voter feels secure with giving their voter ID, which is legal, and securing the fact that that person is who they claim to be. One of the things I think you should include further is to have voter ID checkpoints for the absentee. If I were to do something medically, I have to include my insurance card, and I have to send that through when I need something done medically. I don't see why that a voter ID of some form can be included with absentee. A possibility, piggybacking on some of the things that were already discussed, coordinating of your departments, not your departments, but of the departments of the state, possibly with DDS and vital records, could help possibly eliminate the voter records that we have that have not been complete. Another concern for me is the drop box locations. I vote in a location in North Fulton. My early voting location is at a library. There is a drop box there, and it's early voting. There's nothing to prevent me from inserting an absentee ballot into that drop box and then walking in to the location to vote. That would allow 2 votes. I don't know if there's security on the other end that they're checking that, but that is a variable that I don't think has been considered. So I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate you being here today. Tess Sharp. Tess Sharp. Ms. Sharp, going once, going twice, gone. Alicia Stallworth. Ms. Stallworth, good to have you today.
Hi.
Please tell us who you're with, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
No problem. Thank you for having me today. My name is Alicia Stallworth. I am the Georgia State Director for Planned Parenthood Southeast Advocates. So thank you, Chair and committee members, for having me today. I'm going to speak on behalf of Planned Parenthood Southeast Advocates, as I just stated. So without access to voting, our ability to advocate for reproductive rights and access to healthcare is jeopardized, which is why Planned Parenthood Southeast Advocates is speaking up to strongly oppose HB 531 on behalf of our almost 300,000 members. With almost 16,000 confirmed deaths by COVID-19 in Georgia, protecting our citizens' health should be our top priority. Over this past election cycle, we saw Georgians turn out in historic numbers by mail to keep their families, themselves and their families safe. When our voting rights are threatened, so are our most fundamental democratic values. Restricting access to the ballot box should never be a priority for elected officials, but is egregiously irresponsible and dangerous in the middle of a global pandemic. In 2020 general election, our state saw over 2.5 million Georgians participate in early voting, with over 250,000 of those votes occurring on Saturday and Sundays. As some of my other colleagues have mentioned about the importance of maintaining Saturday and Sunday voting, we also are aligned with that, of course. Just reiterating once again that weekend voting expands access to working class Georgians, and any effort to eliminate voting on weekends and holidays is a direct attack on hardworking citizens. HB 531 reduces drop box access by limiting them to early voting locations and only during voting hours, requires counters to accrue the cost of 24/7 surveillance of these drop boxes, sets new and restrictive absentee ballot return deadlines, reduces the time the counties can mail ballots to their constituents, and slashes 108 hours of early voting. Therefore, shorten the vote by mail application window by 113 days. HB 531 also aims to ban mobile voting, which was primarily used at nursing homes during a pandemic. This provision directly threatens Georgia's most vulnerable citizens. The COVID-19 pandemic changed how many people decided to submit their ballots, and providing voters with options like drop boxes and weekend voting protected our citizens. Furthermore, it proved that when given more options to participate in the democratic process, Georgians would exercise the right to vote. If enacted, this bill would cause irreparable harm to Georgia elections, the future of our state, and the health of our citizens. Lawmakers' priority should be expanding access to voting, not suppressing the ability for Georgians to cast ballots. We are opposed to this piece of legislation and encourage you to consider the impact that it will have on the rights of those who you have taken the oath to serve. That's my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Delworth. And now I believe we are going to go to a witness on who will be testifying via Zoom. Okay, at this time, we are going to bring Mr. David Cross via Zoom to testify.
Hi, I'm here. Hi. Thank you, everyone. I need to share my screen so that folks there can see what I'm showing. Let's see. We all set?
All right, Mr. Cross, if you will unmute yourself, you should be ready to go.
I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
Okay, I think it was our fault. Are you there, Mr. Cross?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Can you see my screen also?
Did you put up a Georgia election integrity screen?
Yes.
Yes, we see that.
All right, so I'll be brief. I generally agree with most of the provisions of this bill, and I hope that you'll add some things to it. What I'm looking at is securing the vote. Election ballot count accuracy and digital security are severely lacking in Georgia elections. How many accidental ballot batch scans happened in the November 2020 election? I don't think very many people know this, but I've provided this to the Secretary of State. There were 9,870 duplicate potential ballot scans, not just individual ballots, but entire batches. All right, I'll show you what it looks like. So the data that I've got here was sourced directly from the Secretary of State. You can click this link if you like to. It'll take you to this page. And you don't click here, but you click the third here. And what you get is this page. The third link takes you to the data that the Secretary of State provides. There are 41,899 lines of data on this spreadsheet. And it gives you every single scan that happened. So we used a simple function in Excel to search for suspected duplicate scans. We found thousands, okay? And what you can see here at the very top here is there are two ballot scans that match each other, 745 votes for Biden, 166 for Trump. And then there's an exact same duplicate for that same number. Each one of these that we go through from Fulton County, Clayton County had quite a few, Gwinnett County had quite a few as well too. But we highlighted thousands of instances where there are duplicate numbers of exact ballot results. And none of this was caught by the Secretary of State's office. And it could be easily caught. I mean, if it was caught by me, it should be able to be caught by, by a third party that can do this type of work. Next page here. We even found batches where the name of the scan batch showed a remarkable similarity to the name of another. So you can see in the center of the page, absentee ballot scanner batch, or scanner 3 batch 111 matches, but the number of votes don't match. Again, this is somebody who ran the ballots through and said, oh my gosh, I don't know if we did that. Let's run them through again. Again, what we found was 9,870 votes, or not votes, but scanned ballot batches. And the difference in the total number of votes was 56,239. Very quickly here with regard to digital security. In Gwinnett County, 76 of 157 polling locations in Gwinnett are churches. Many churches and county facilities have Chinese-made TCL brand televisions in the same vicinity as the polling machines. We have evidence and confirmation of digital intrusion from China into Georgia precincts. Intrusions were achieved through Chinese-made TCL televisions. The Secretary of State tried to publicly discredit the testimony of Jovan Pulitzer, but I watched it as it happened when I was giving my testimony at the Senate hearing at the state capitol. On the morning of the
Mr.
election,
Cross, I want to give you time to wrap up.
I'm going quick. On the morning of January 5th, I witnessed a Chinese-made TCL television with streaming capabilities being installed at George Pierce Park. What I would recommend to the board here is unplugging all network access devices, including these televisions, for the next election. I think that'll severely limit people's ability to be able to hack into the system over here. We brought the errors and oversights to the attention of the Secretary of State and the governor. None of what we found has been addressed by the Secretary of State or the governor. A simple professional audit would have caught all of these errors months ago. Voter GA is suing Fulton County and Gwinnett County to gain access to the ballots for a forensic audit. We estimate the cost of the audit will be approximately $40,000. But why must the citizens of Georgia sue the counties for access to their votes? Why do we have to do this at our expense? Whoops. The Georgia legislature has the power actually to decertify the election, but it won't change the outcome, but it will force the Secretary of State to take corrective action. That's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate you being here with us today.
Yep.
Okay. Also via Zoom, Jennifer Duran. Ms. Duran. Is Ms. Duran? She has dropped off. Okay. Okay. The Misty Martin via Zoom. Misty Martin? Miss Martin, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Now, I said Miss Martin and it's showing up Hampton.
Yeah, there's some things called a divorce, but that's okay.
There are some things the committee is not going to get into. but Miss Hampton, I'm sorry, which one?
Hampton. I'll always be a Hampton.
Miss Hampton, thank you. Miss Hampton, we appreciate you being with us today. Please tell us who you're with and we'd be happy to hear from you.
I am Misty Hampton. I'm from Douglas, Georgia. I'm with the Coffee County Board of Elections. I am the election supervisor here, and I have been with Coffee County Board of Elections since January of 2009. I had a few more points that I was going to speak on, but as we know, there was a bunch of them that was touched on today. I do have a few that I would really like to point out. The cost is one of the things for the counties that we really need to take in consideration with this bill. Just like with the security paper, that's going to be a major cost to the counties. And then also Mr. Brad made a comment earlier about the long lines of the different counties that are having to deal with the long lines, and that advanced voting sort of helps with that. I agree with him in some sense I don't. I have one precinct here in Coffee County that has 18,000 registered voters in that one precinct. And I never have a voter wait over 20 minutes. My precinct is normally finished voting and packed up and ready to go by 7:30 and back to my office. Speaking in regards to the voter having to provide voter IDs, I don't see a problem with that at all. Some people are complaining about the cost and how it would disenfranchise on the right of different voters, but they need to realize that every election office, they can get a free voter's ID at every elections office in the state of Georgia. That is a law that every elections office has to provide them with as long as they are a registered voter in that county. It is free to the voter. The lady that just spoke with just a few moments ago, how she mentioned about the drop boxes, how the voter could go into the drop box or drop a ballot into the drop box and then go inside and vote. There are precautions for that to stop so that second ballot would not be counted. So another thing that I really want to touch on is the scanning early, where y'all have in this bill where we shall start scanning ballots prior to election day. I see so many problems with that. Number one, the security of the tabulation. Everyone else is human, and I know that when they are sitting there opening those ballots, you can't tell me that someone's not going to look at the ballot and see who the voter has voted for, and they're going to keep in mind of how many one candidate has or the other. Also, and I'm going to speak to this on a personal level, I had a gentleman come to me on election day in 2018, and he was like, my ballot had been stolen. And I asked him, I said, sir, what do you mean your ballot has been stolen? A lady came in my house and took my ballot, but I didn't vote that ballot. So I explained to him, give me just a few moments and I will see if his ballot has been received into my office. So I called my assistant and she checked, and yes, his ballot had been received into my office. So I canceled his absentee ballot by mail. He signed an affidavit stating that he did not vote that ballot. This was an 86-year-old gentleman who was very
Ms. Hampton,
distraught.
I want to give you the ability to wrap up.
Okay. He was very distraught about his ballot being not his vote. If we open these ballots prior to election night, what are we going to do to these voters whose ballot has been taken, just like this 86-year-old gentleman? We would have to disenfranchise his right to vote in person. There is no way I would have been able to go back and cancel his absentee ballot and allow him to vote in person. Please do not pass that part of the bill. Thank you.
Representative Deloach, you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. Can you tell me if you certified all your elections in Coffee County in the last cycle?
I certified in the November election, I did not certify the recount, the electronic recount. No, sir.
And can you tell us the reason for that?
Yes, sir. The reason for that was with Dominion, they were scanning the ballots. And the way I do mine is when I scan a batch of ballots, and my scanner, the ICC scanner, was having major problems. And I asked for a second scanner and I was told I'd have to buy one for $25,000 to come to find out. But we had the Dominion tech come in and he was showing me the correct way to scan it. And he scanned a batch of ballots twice. When I scan a batch of ballots and it does not take all the batch, I completely discard that whole batch and start it over. And he did not do that. And so that is how we ended up with 50 extra ballots for that. And I knew that those numbers were not correct. My reports would not reflect that. So I cannot faithfully sign my name to a certification that I know is incorrect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you.
Okay. We have gone about 45 minutes longer than the chair had intended. We will have a meeting tomorrow. We have a few more witnesses that the chair intends to allow to address the committee tomorrow. But those that are signed up today, our staff will hold on to those for us. So as I mentioned to the committee members, you will be getting an email with the committee substitute that I mentioned to you earlier and went through the changes that would be in that. Unless there are any further questions at this point, we will stand. Ms. Alexander?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you're saying we're going to go back and get some more amendments, which it'll probably be about 100 pages of this bill by the time we get it, I'm assuming.
No, not
Any
that many.
chance of a physical analysis for the counties based on what you've heard from all of the speakers today?
You can request a fiscal information from any of the counties you would like or the state.
Thank you. But,
Yes, ma'am.
but nothing we will be doing for that. What I'm saying is there,
We
the counties have already
as
said.
me and you, and if
committee.
you want to, you can. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. We will stand adjourned and we will see you tomorrow at 3:30.